My name is Alara, and I am 37 years old. The most effective lie I ever told was that I had received a phone call from a dead man. And that lie was the bullet I had spent half my life carefully crafting to shoot a monster straight through the heart. It began, as all the best tragedies do, with love. A perfect, sun-drenched, shatterproof kind of love. My father, Arthur, was the architect of my world. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but of quiet, unshakable devotion. He smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, a comforting scent that clung to his worn tweed jackets. His laugh was a low, rumbling sound that seemed to start deep in his chest, a sound that meant all was right with the world. He was a historian, a professor at the local university, who believed that understanding the past, its triumphs, its follies, its cautionary tales, was the only way to build a decent future. He moved with a deliberate, thoughtful pace, as if he were constantly weighing the historical significance of each moment. Our home was a fortress of knowledge and warmth, its walls lined not just with books, but with his hand-drawn maps of ancient empires and framed prints of historical documents. The very air was thick with the scent of my mother's baking, cinnamon and vanilla, and the sound of classical music drifting from the old record player in the corner, its vinyl hiss a constant, soothing companion. My mother, Lena, was his perfect counterpart. If my father was the steady stone of our foundation, my mother was the garden that grew around it, tending to everyone and everything with a gentle hand. Her love was an active, nurturing force. She knew the names of every bird that visited our feeders and could coax the most stubborn rose bush into bloom. She was a woman whose heart had no corners, a soft place for everyone to land. I was their only child, the cherished, improbable center of their small, perfect universe. They had been told for years that they couldn't have children, so my arrival was treated as nothing short of a miracle. I was given their undivided attention, their boundless affection, a childhood wrapped in the cotton wool of their love. And then, after years of being little more than a whispered story, my Uncle Julian came back into our lives. Julian was my father's younger brother, the prodigal son returning not in rags, but in tailored suits. He'd left our quiet town years before I was born, under a vague cloud of youthful indiscretion that the family narrative had softened to seeking his fortune. He returned polished, successful, and dripping with a charisma that was almost blinding. Where my father was quiet strength and gentle wisdom, Julian was a firework display, all dazzling light and explosive energy. He would walk into a room, and the center of gravity would shift, every eye drawn to him. He commanded attention without saying a word, his smile a calculated weapon that disarmed everyone it touched. He looked like my father, but a sharper, more defined version, as if a sculptor had taken my father's gentle features and chiseled them into something more predatory, more suited to the hunt. He told stories of his travels, of deals made in gleaming skyscrapers in cities I could only imagine, and he showered us with gifts that were both extravagant and perfectly chosen. For me, it was a first edition of The Little Prince with a personal inscription about seeing with the heart. For my mother, a delicate pearl necklace. For my father, a bottle of impossibly old single malt scotch. He became a fixture, the exciting, worldly uncle who taught me how to play chess with a ruthless, strategic mind and bought me my first silk dress, a garment that felt alien and wonderful against my skin. My mother was utterly charmed, seeing in him the adventurous spirit she'd secretly wished her husband possessed. My father, though he loved his brother in the way you love a part of your own history, seemed reserved. I was too young to understand the subtle tension, the flicker of deep-seated unease in my father's eyes when Julian would hold court at our dinner table, his booming laughter filling the space that was once my father's quiet domain. Julian called himself a financial wizard, an investor who could turn pennies into fortunes. He spoke a language of derivatives, portfolios, and futures that was as foreign as ancient Greek to my parents. He offered to help my father manage his modest university pension and savings. "Let me make your money work for you, Arthur," he'd say, clapping him on the back with a familiarity that felt more like a claim of ownership. "It's a jungle out there, and I know the path. It's the least I can do for my big brother." My father, a man who understood the intricate fall of the Roman Empire but not the baffling machinations of a stock market, eventually, reluctantly agreed. I remember the night he did. He and my mother had been talking in low voices for hours after I was supposed to be asleep. My father was hesitant, grounded in the belief that security came from what you could hold, what you could touch. My mother, dazzled by Julian's success, saw his offer as a lifeline, a chance to have more than just enough. It was her voice, full of hope, that finally convinced him the decay was slow, a poison that works over years, not minutes. It started with small things, cracks in the perfect veneer of our lives. My father, once so financially secure and content in his stability, began to look perpetually worried. He'd stare out the window for long stretches, his pipe unlit in his hand. The discussions behind the closed doors of his study became more frequent, the hushed tones now strained with anxiety. Julian was always there, the calm voice of reason in the storm he was creating. "The market is volatile, Arthur. A necessary correction. We have to be patient. Don't worry, I'm watching it like a hawk." He would say things to my mother, pulling her aside while my father was out, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Arthur is too cautious. He doesn't understand that to win big, you have to risk big. He thinks in terms of salaries and pensions. I think in terms of dynasties." He was positioning himself as the expert, my father as the naive academic who was in over his head. The warmth in our home began to cool. The smell of my mother's baking became less frequent, replaced by a sterile silence that felt heavier than any sound. My father, in a desperate attempt to create liquidity for Julian's rebalancing, started selling off his beloved first editions, one by one. It was an agony I watched from the doorway of his study. First a signed Hemingway, which he wrapped in cloth with trembling hands. Then a rare, beautiful collection of Renaissance maps he used to trace voyages with me on rainy afternoons. Each sail was a piece of his soul being carved away. Julian would watch, his face a mask of perfect sympathy, and offer to lend them money to get through the rough patch, creating a debt that was emotional as much as it was financial. He was a savior, always swooping in to fix a problem he himself had created. My mother began to lean on him, to see him as the strong one, while my father, worn down by a silent financial battle he didn't understand, began to retreat into himself. The light in his eyes, the one that sparked when he spoke of history or looked at my mother, dimmed. The rumbling laugh became a distant memory. The breaking point was a quiet, gray Tuesday. I came home from school to find my father in his study, not reading, not writing, but staring at a single sheet of paper on his desk. He sat so still he might have been a statue. The afternoon sun cast a long, lonely shadow across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The paper was a final notice from the bank. The investments Julian had managed, the ones that were supposed to secure their future, were gone. Not just the profits, not just the savings, but everything. It was a complete, catastrophic wipeout. Julian had an explanation, of course. He arrived that evening, his face a grim mask. He spoke of a flash crash no one could have predicted, a rogue trader in a foreign market, a litany of sophisticated excuses that meant nothing. What they meant was ruin. My father was broken, not by the loss of the money, but by the loss of his ability to provide, the quiet dignity that had been his bedrock. He had built his world on the principle of integrity, and he had been made a fool of in his own home. He passed away less than a year later. The doctors called it a heart attack, a failure of the physical organ, but I knew. He died of a broken spirit, a corrosion of the soul. At the funeral, Julian was the picture of grieving strength. He held my mother's hand, his face etched with sorrow. He stood at the pulpit and delivered a soaring eulogy about my father's integrity, his kindness, his quiet genius, and he promised to take care of us, to honor his brother's memory. And in that moment, watching him stand there, performing his grief for an audience that hung on his every word, a cold, hard knot of hatred formed in my stomach. I was 16, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic or proof, that he was the cause. But I had no proof. I was just a grieving girl with a monstrous intuition, and he was the benevolent uncle, our family savior. For the next 20 years, I lived a double life. To the world, and especially to Julian, I was the grieving niece he had so generously taken under his wing. He paid for my college education. With my father's stolen money, I was sure of it, framing it as a sacred duty to his late brother. He positioned himself as my surrogate father, a role he played with chilling perfection. He'd call me every Sunday, inquire about my studies, offer fatherly advice on boys and careers. He reveled in the image of himself as the patriarch who had stepped in to save his brother's broken family. I played my part just as well. I was grateful, deferential, quiet. I let him believe he had me fooled, that I saw him as my hero. But beneath the surface of the quiet, studious girl, I was a hunter. Every choice I made was a step in a long, silent war. I didn't get a degree in literature, as my father would have loved. I got a degree in forensic accounting. I took night classes in psychological profiling. I devoured every book I could find on strategy, deception, and revenge. My father had taught me to revere history, and I learned from it. I studied the long, patient campaigns of spies, the slow poisoning of court intrigue, the meticulous planning behind rebellions. I learned that the most successful campaigns are not won with brute force, but with patience, intelligence, and a deep, intimate understanding of your enemy. Julian's weakness wasn't greed. That was just a symptom, a tool. His true vulnerability, his core, was his ego. His carefully constructed public image as a benevolent patriarch, a pillar of the community, a man of unimpeachable character. That was his center of gravity, and I was going to pull it out from under him. I spent years gathering my ammunition, piece by painstaking piece. It was a slow, agonizing archaeology of his betrayal. The work was my life. I gave up friendships, relationships, the simple joys of a normal young life. My apartment was not a home. It was a war room, its walls covered in charts and timelines. I traced shell corporations through Panama and the Cayman Islands, followed dark money trails that snaked through a dozen countries, and slowly, painstakingly, pieced together the labyrinthine scheme he had used to drain my father's accounts and those of countless others. I found the rogue traitor he blamed, an old associate of Julian's named Marcus Thorne, who had been paid handsomely to disappear to a quiet life in South America. It took me 2 years, and a private investigator I paid for with my meager salary to find him. I never contacted him. I just needed to know his name. I found other families, other victims, a retired schoolteacher, a small business owner, a doctor. I saw a pattern of financial devastation left in his wake, all cleverly disguised as bad luck or unfortunate market downturns. He was a predator who cloaked himself in the sheep's clothing of a trusted financial advisor. But the evidence, for all its volume, was circumstantial, complex, and buried under decades of legal obfuscation. A court case would be messy, expensive, and uncertain. He would hire the best lawyers, drown me in motions and delays. And even if I won, what would be the result? A prison sentence. It wasn't enough. Justice for Julian couldn't be a prison sentence. It had to be a public dismantling. He needed to be unmade in the same way he had unmade my father. His reputation, the very thing he had killed for, had to turn to ash in his mouth. And that's when the idea for the phone call began to form. It was poetic, in a dark, twisted way. A message from the world of the dead, the world my father now inhabited. It couldn't come to me. That would be too convenient, too easily dismissed as the fantasy of a grieving daughter. It had to come to someone unimpeachable, someone Julian respected, even feared on some subconscious level. And I knew exactly who that was. Mrs. Eleanor Davis, my 8th grade history teacher. Mrs. Davis was a legend in our town, a woman of formidable intellect and ironclad integrity. She taught history with the same passion my father had, but with a sharp, no-nonsense edge. But more importantly, she had a history with Julian. Long before I was born, before Julian left town the first time, they had been involved. It was a footnote in the family history, a youthful romance that had ended badly when, as the story went, Julian had betrayed her trust in some fundamental way. Julian, in his boundless arrogance, had always spoken of her with a strange mix of condescension and lingering respect, as if she were the one woman he had never been able to fully conquer or fool. Her judgment of him, I suspected, still mattered. She was his moral blind spot. She had retired years ago and now lived a quiet life, her reputation as solid as granite. She was the perfect, unwitting instrument. This is where the plan became art. I couldn't just call Mrs. Davis myself. The execution had to be flawless, untraceable. This was the culmination of 2 decades of planning, and there was no room for error. I spent months researching. I acquired a sophisticated voice modulator online, the kind used by professional investigators. I didn't want a generic, scary voice. I wanted something specific, something resonant. I layered my own voice with sampled cadences from old home video recordings of a distant uncle on my mother's side who had passed away years ago, my Uncle Michael, a gentle soul my father had adored. His voice was soft, with a slight, hesitant stammer. It was a ghoulish detail, but a necessary one. The name Michael would be the first hook, a name with no direct connection to Julian's crimes, making it all the more confusing and unnerving. I used a spoofed, untraceable number, routing the call through a daisy chain of international servers. The call itself would be short, under a minute, filled with static I had engineered myself, as if it were struggling to cross a great cosmic distance. The message had to be perfect, cryptic, personal, and containing a kernel of information that only Julian could understand. I waited for the perfect moment. Julian, now in his late 60s, was at the absolute zenith of his public life. He was chairing a massive charity gala to raise money for a new history wing at the university where my father had once taught. It was his magnum opus of hypocrisy, a celebration of his own perceived benevolence, cementing his legacy in the town he had once fled. The week before the gala, I made the call. My hands were shaking, but my heart was steady. I sat in my darkened apartment, the equipment laid out before me, and staged it perfectly. I made my voice sound weak, distant, breaking through a veil of static. I dialed her number. I asked for someone who didn't exist. When she, confused, said I had the wrong number, I delivered the hook. No, my modulated voice crackled, a ghost in the machine. This is the right place. You knew his brother. You knew Arthur. I let that hang in the air, a silence thick with implication. Then, the core of the message, the poison pill I had spent 20 years formulating. Tell Julian, tell him Arthur knows. Tell him to look under the old willow. The debt must be paid. And then I added the final, chilling touch. My name is Michael. Tell him I'm sorry I had to go. The line went dead. As I'd predicted, Mrs. Davis, a rational woman shaken and unnerved by the specific mention of Arthur and the ghostly, familiar yet unfamiliar voice, did exactly what a person of her integrity would do. She tried to make sense of it. And the only way to do that was to pass the message on. She called Julian. I can only imagine that conversation. Julian, the man of supreme logic and control, being told by the one woman whose opinion he secretly valued that she'd received a phone call from a dead man with a message specifically for him. His first reaction would be dismissal, annoyance, but the details would eat at him like acid. Arthur, the name Michael, and the phrases, the debt must be paid, and look under the old willow. Because the old willow wasn't a random choice. I had found it mentioned in one of my father's old journals. It was the place, on the edge of my childhood property, where a 19-year-old Julian, long before I was born, had made a secret pact with my father. My father, then a young teaching assistant, had lent Julian his entire savings, a small but significant sum, to start a business. It was a debt Julian never repaid, instead using the money to flee town after his first series of local failures and betrayals, including the one against Eleanor Davis. The promise to repay it had been made under that tree. It was a secret history, a piece of the past Julian thought was buried and forgotten forever. The message was a ghost from a grave he had dug himself. The gala was a glittering, obscene affair. The ballroom was bathed in golden light. Champagne flowed, and the most influential people in the city were there to pay homage to him. Julian was on stage, accepting thunderous applause, the benevolent king in his castle. I sat at a table near the front, wearing the silk dress he had bought me all those years ago. My heart was a cold, steady drum in my chest. He looked different. The confident swagger was still there, but it was brittle. There were dark circles under his eyes I had never seen before. My message, delivered by the ghost of his past, had been working on him. During a lull in the proceedings, a moment for mingling, I approached him. I was the picture of the adoring niece. "Uncle Julian," I said, my voice soft, filled with concern. "You look tired. Is everything all right?" "Of course, Alara. A bit stressed with all this, that's all," he said, patting my hand. I'm glad, I continued, keeping my expression innocent. A strange thing happened, though. Mrs. Davis called me. She was quite flustered. She said she'd had a message for you, something about my father and a willow tree. The blood drained from his face. It was instantaneous and total. His mask of composure didn't just crack, it shattered. For a fraction of a second, I saw it, the raw, primal terror of a man who believed in nothing but saw a ghost. "That's ridiculous," he blustered, a little too loudly. A few nearby heads turned. The woman is old. She's confused. But his eyes, his shifty, panicked eyes, darted around the grand ballroom as if he expected to see my father standing in the shadows. This was the moment, the final twist of the knife. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that was for him and him alone. She said the man on the phone called himself Michael. I said, my gaze locked on his. But the strangest thing, Uncle. The voice she described, the static, the slight stammer, it reminded me of those old recordings you used to keep in your office. The ones you used to play to practice altering your voice for your business calls. His face went from pale to sheet white. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the Scotch glass in his hand trembling. And in my eyes, he didn't see his grieving, docile niece anymore. He saw my father. He saw 2 decades of silent, patient hatred. He saw his own tactics, his own love for deception and manipulation, mirrored back at him in a horrifying tableau. The call was never about a ghost. The plot twist wasn't that a dead man could call. It was that I could become a ghost myself. The call wasn't the weapon. It was the psychological trigger, meticulously designed and pulled, to make him believe he was being haunted. His own bottomless guilt would do the rest. I didn't need to present my evidence. I didn't need to scream or accuse. I had planted a seed of pure paranoia in the most fertile ground imaginable, a guilty conscience. I smiled a small, sad smile, squeezed his arm, and said, "I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished," before turning and walking away, leaving him to his phantoms. In the weeks that followed, Julian unraveled completely. He became erratic, paranoid. He accused his business partners of spying on him. He installed a state-of-the-art security system at his mansion, not to keep burglars out, but to keep ghosts at bay. He'd call me in the middle of the night, his voice thick with alcohol and fear, rambling, asking what I knew, what my father had told me before he died. He was chasing a ghost that I had manufactured, and in his desperate flight from it, he began making mistakes. Fatal business errors. He tried to move his illicit funds, a frantic shuffling of assets that attracted the immediate attention of federal regulators who had likely been watching him for years, just waiting for a mistake. The empire built on lies began to crumble under the weight of his own fear. His downfall was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, public collapse. His partners abandoned him, his reputation was ruined, and his fortune evaporated, devoured by lawsuits and federal investigations. He lost everything. He ended his life just like my father had, alone in a quiet room, with a single sheet of paper from a bank detailing his complete and utter ruin. Was it worth it? Did spending 20 years of my life fueled by a cold, calculated rage bring my father back? No. Did it bring me peace? For a long time, I thought the finality of his ruin would be a victory cry, a moment of pure cathartic release. But standing in the silence of my reclaimed life, I found that revenge is not a destination. It's a fire that consumes everything, including the person who lights it. I had sacrificed my youth, my capacity for simple happiness, my own innocence at the altar of his destruction. I had become a mirror of his own monstrosity, using deception and psychological manipulation as my tools. The justice I delivered was absolute, a perfect, terrible symmetry. But the cost was a part of my own soul. I am free of him now, but I am also haunted, not by his ghost, but by the ghost of the woman I might have been if he had never returned. Justice was served, but it will never, ever feel like a victory.